Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Last time we started looking at modern Indian history, which, as you know, is super important if you're a UPSC aspirant or even just a history enthusiast.
Absolutely.
So today we're going even deeper into a period that, well, really changed everything, the Carnatic Wars.
Yeah, you can't really understand how British power became what it did in India without understanding these wars, right?
Exactly. So hit that subscribe button and like this so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
Definitely. Stay tuned.
Okay, so to set the scene, we're talking late 17th, early 18th century.
Right.
The Mughal Empire is, well, it's not what it used to be. It's declining. And this, of course, creates this power vacuum,
A vacuum a lot of different groups wanted to fill.
including, of course, the European powers.
Exactly. And this is where the French East India Company really comes onto the scene. They established Pondicherry in 1674.
It became their main base, right?
Exactly. And they're expanding their influence pretty steadily. But they weren't just content with trading.
They wanted more.
Much more. They had their eyes set on territorial control, on political power,
They wanted a piece of the pie.
a very large piece.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing for them, was it? I mean, there were some setbacks along the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. There were some bumps in the road. You had European conflicts like the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, and then the War of Spanish Succession.
Those must have been major distractions.
Definitely. They were forced to give up some of their early gains because of what was happening back in Europe. It's fascinating how events on one continent were having such a direct impact on what was happening in India.
Things were very interconnected, even back then.
Absolutely. And the French ambitions in India, they were often directly tied to and sometimes even held back by these power struggles happening thousands of miles away in Europe.
It's like a ripple effect across the globe.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But you know what? The French, they were persistent. They were determined. In 1720, they reorganized their East India Company, bring in new leadership, new resources, and they're basically saying, we're back and we're here to stay.
They weren't giving up that easily.
Not at all. They were ready to leave their mark on the Indian landscape no matter what.
So this basically sets the stage for the Carnatic Wars.
Exactly. The calm before the storm, you could say.
But before we dive into the wars themselves, maybe we should take a quick step back for those who might not be as familiar with this part of India.
Good point.
Could you explain what the Carnatic region actually was? Where was this all happening?
Sure. So for those who don't know, the Carnatic refers to that southeastern coast of India.
Right.
It was incredibly important, both strategically and economically. You have fertile land, bustling ports, all these trade routes crisscrossing the region.
It was prime location.
Absolutely. Controlling the Carnatic meant controlling a huge chunk of India's wealth, its resources. And that, of course, is why it became this focal point for both the British and the French.
It was a prize worth fighting for.
Exactly. The heart of the struggle.
Okay, so we've got the French. They're back with a vengeance. And they've got their eyes on the Carnatic. But then, of course, you have the British, who are also vying for power in the region.
Right. It's a classic rivalry.
And this rivalry plays out in these three Carnatic Wars.
Yeah.
But were these wars just isolated conflicts, or were they part of a bigger story?
That's a great question, and one that any UPSC aspirant should really consider. The Carnatic Wars, they weren't just isolated events. They were like chapters in this much longer story.
A saga, almost.
Exactly. A saga of Anglo-French rivalry, one that was playing out not just in India, but across continents. It had huge consequences for the global balance of power. Each war, each chapter, was connected to the one before it, building on the tensions, the ambitions that were already there.
So to understand one war, you need to understand all of them.
Exactly. They're all pieces of the same puzzle.
So let's dive into that first piece, shall we? The First Carnatic War kicks off in 1740. But what's interesting is that the actual trigger for this war didn't even happen in India.
You're absolutely right. It started because of something happening thousands of miles away in Europe.
It's a bit like what we were talking about earlier, with those earlier setbacks the French faced.
Precisely. The First Carnatic War was sparked by the War of Austrian Succession, and it just goes to show, again, how what was happening in Europe had this direct impact on events in India.
They might have been oceans apart, but their fates were intertwined.
Absolutely. These European powers, they saw their colonies as extensions of their power back home.
So they were willing to fight for them, even on foreign soil.
Precisely. Their rivalries, their ambitions, they didn't stop at the borders of Europe, they carried them across the world.
It's amazing how these global power struggles were playing out on the Indian stage.
And it's crucial to remember it wasn't just Europeans fighting Europeans. You had Indian rulers, Indian soldiers, all caught up in this conflict,
They were forced to choose sides.
or risk being swept away by these larger forces.
It must have been a very difficult position to be in.
Absolutely. Imagine being a ruler in India at this time, trying to navigate these competing interests, these powerful forces vying for your allegiance.
It must have felt like the world was closing in on them.
In a way, it was. The Carnatic Wars weren't this simple clash of civilizations. They were this complex tapestry of alliances, rivalries, with Indian rulers playing a key role.
It makes it even more fascinating to study, doesn't it? You have all these layers of history, all these different perspectives to consider.
Absolutely. For anyone who really wants to understand this period, you have to go beyond the simple narratives. You have to look at the human stories, the personal ambitions, the political maneuvering that was happening behind the scenes.
You have to understand the individuals who were shaping these events, not just the grand sweep of history.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
So in this first war, the French managed to pull off a pretty significant victory right at the start, didn't they?
They did. In 1746, they captured Madras.
Which was a major British trading hub, right?
Exactly. And it was a huge blow to British prestige. It really showed the world that the French were a force to be reckoned with in India.
It was a bold statement.
It certainly was.
Right.
And it also reveals a lot about how the balance of power was shifting in India at this time.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the capture of Madras wasn't just about military strength. It showed that the French were able to forge alliances with local rulers, that they could exploit the divisions that already existed within Indian society.
They were playing the game, weren't they?
They were playing it very well. They understood that to truly succeed in India, they needed to do more than just win battles. They needed to master the political landscape as well.
So it's not just about military might, it's about strategy, about understanding the local context.
Exactly. And that's something the French, at least in these early stages, seemed to grasp better than the British.
But this is where the story gets even more complex, right?
Mhm.
Because it's not just about the British and the French anymore. You have all these other players on the board, like the Nawab of Arcot and the Nizam of Hyderabad.
Oh, absolutely. And to truly understand the Carnatic Wars, you need to understand the role of these Indian rulers.
They weren't just pawns in a European game.
Not at all. They had their own ambitions, their own agendas, and they weren't afraid to use the British and the French to further their own interests.
It sounds like a very intricate dance, with all of these different players trying to stay one step ahead of each other.
It was a constant game of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties.
And in the middle of all this, you have the people of India, their lives being shaped by these power struggles.
Their fate hanging in the balance.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about real people, real lives, being impacted by these grand events.
Absolutely. And it's something we should never forget.
So we've got this initial French victory at Madras. They've shown their strength, their political savvy. But how does this play out in the long run? Do they manage to hold on to their gains?
Well, as we often see in history, early victories don't always guarantee lasting success.
The tide can turn very quickly.
It certainly can. Remember those European conflicts we talked about? Those wars that were happening thousands of miles away?
The ones that kept pulling the French away from India.
Exactly. Well, the War of Austrian Succession eventually ends with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748.
So that must have had some impact on the situation in India.
It did. One of the things this treaty stipulated was that Madras had to be returned to the British.
So even though they won this key battle, events on the other side of the world forced them to give up their prize.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected the world was becoming, how events in one place could have such profound consequences for people living thousands of miles away.
And I imagine this didn't sit well with the French.
Oh, not at all. They might have had to give Madras back, but their ambitions, their desire for dominance in India, those remained.
The embers were still burning.
They were smoldering, waiting for the next spark to ignite them.
And that spark, as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, wouldn't be long in coming.
The rivalry was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter a new, even more intense phase.
So stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive into the Carnatic Wars, where we'll explore the Second Carnatic War, a conflict that will be even more complex, even more dramatic, and even more pivotal in the struggle for control of India.
We'll delve deeper into the strategies, the key players, and the turning points that shaped this crucial chapter in Indian history. It's a story you won't want to miss.
And as always, we encourage you to leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below.
We'd love to hear your perspectives and insights as we continue this journey through history together.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you then. So the First Carnatic War, it ends in a sort of stalemate, you could say. But the rivalry, oh, that was far from over. In fact, it was about to get even more intense.
And this takes us to the Second Carnatic War, which starts in 1749, just a year after the first one ends. And it seems like this time, things got even more complicated. More players on the board, so to speak.
Absolutely. Things got a lot more tangled. And a big part of that was the death of Nizam-ul-Mulk in 1748. He was the founder of the independent kingdom of Hyderabad.
Right, I remember reading about him. He was a pretty important figure, right?
Oh, incredibly important. Think of it this way. The Nizam was basically the ruler of this huge, powerful state. And this state had emerged as the Mughal Empire started to weaken.
So his death created a power vacuum,
A
right?
massive one. And of course, whenever there's a power vacuum, you have all these contenders rushing in to try and fill it. That's exactly what happened.
And I'm guessing the British and the French saw this as an opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't going to miss a chance like this. Both sides saw this succession crisis as a way to further their own interests in the region.
So now it's not just about European rivalries.
Yeah.
You have these internal Indian conflicts that get woven into the whole struggle for control of the subcontinent.
Exactly. It's like adding another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. And the French, especially under their leader Dupleix, were really good at playing this game.
Dupleix. Now, he was a pretty ambitious guy, wasn't he?
Oh, incredibly ambitious. He was shrewd, a brilliant strategist, and he saw this succession crisis as his chance to make the French the dominant power in the south. He decided to back Muzaffar Jung, one of the contenders for the Nizam's throne.
Okay, so the French have their guy, but what about the British? They weren't just going to sit back and watch, were they?
Of course not. They weren't about to let the French just walk in and take over. So they decided to back Nazir Jung, another contender for the throne. And they also supported Anwaruddin Khan, who was the Nawab of Carnatic at the time.
So basically you have this proxy war playing out, right?
Yeah.
The British and the French, each backing their own candidate, each trying to install a ruler who would be in their pocket.
Precisely. It's like a game of chess, but with the fate of an entire region hanging in the balance.
It's fascinating how these seemingly local power struggles become part of this much larger global conflict.
It really shows how interconnected things were becoming. And it's something that, again, UPSC aspirants should really pay attention to.
You have to understand the local context to understand the larger picture.
Exactly. And I think what makes the Carnatic Wars so interesting is that they weren't just these abstract historical events. They had real consequences for the people living in these regions.
Right. It's easy to forget that there were real people whose lives were being upended by these power struggles.
Exactly. Their lives, their homes, their families, everything was being affected by the decisions of these powerful rulers and these foreign companies.
Okay, so you've got the stage set for this major conflict. British and French, each backing their own candidates. Tensions are high. What happens next? How does this war actually begin?
Well, things really kick off in 1749 with the Battle of Amber.
Amber, okay. Who was involved in this battle?
So on one side, you have Chanda Sahib, who, remember, was backed by the French. And on the other side, you have the forces of Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja, who was supported by the British.
Who wins?
It was a brutal battle. But Chanda Sahib, with the help of the French, emerges victorious.
So it seems like the French and their allies have the upper hand early on in this war.
They do, but as we saw in the First Carnatic War, the British weren't going to go down without a fight. And this is where one of the most famous figures in British Indian history enters the picture. Robert Clive.
Ah, yes, Robert Clive. I've definitely heard his name, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details. Could you tell us a little more about him? What role did he play in all of this?
So at this point, Robert Clive was a young officer in the British East India Company's army, but he was already showing signs of the military genius that would later make him a legend. In 1751, he pulls off this incredibly daring raid on Arcot.
Arcot. Why was that important?
Arcot was a strategically vital town, and it had recently fallen to the French-backed forces, so Clive basically decides to take it back.
But wasn't that a huge risk, attacking a fortified town like that?
It was a massive gamble. Clive only had a small force under his command, but he was a brilliant strategist. He calculated that a surprise attack might just catch the enemy off guard.
And did it work?
It did. Clive and his men capture Arcot, and then they hold it for weeks against a much larger enemy force. They basically held out until reinforcements arrived. It was a stunning victory, and it really turned the tide of the war back in favor of the British.
So Clive's capture of Arcot, it wasn't just about military tactics, it was about sending a message.
Exactly. It showed the French and their allies that the British weren't going anywhere. It showed that they were willing to take risks to fight hard for what they wanted.
It was a real morale booster for the British, I
Um,
imagine.
Absolutely. But while the British were celebrating Clive's victory, the French were starting to face some serious problems of their own.
Oh, what kind of problems?
Well, you see, Dupleix, as ambitious as he was, his plans were starting to get really expensive. Wars cost money, a lot of money. And the French government back in Paris, they weren't too happy about the bills they were getting for Dupleix's little adventure in India.
So even though he was winning battles, his spending was getting out of control.
Exactly. And eventually, the French government decided they'd had enough. In 1754, they recalled Dupleix.
So he's out, just like that.
Just like that. He is replaced by a guy named Godeheu, who was much more cautious, much more interested in diplomacy than in grand military conquests.
So Dupleix, the architect of all this French success in India, he's basically forced out because he spent too much.
That's pretty much it. And as soon as Godeheu takes over, he starts negotiating a peace treaty with the British.
And what happens?
They signed the Treaty of Pondicherry in 1754, which officially ends the Second Carnatic War.
Another treaty that ends a war.
Right.
Just like the First Carnatic War.
Right. And just like the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the Treaty of Pondicherry basically just restores the status quo. The British keep Madras, the French keep Pondicherry.
So it's like nothing really changed.
On the surface, maybe not, but I think the Second Carnatic War reveals something really important. It shows that European power in India, it wasn't just about getting the support of local rulers anymore.
Right, they were more than just kingmakers at this point.
Exactly. They were becoming the kings themselves. They had their own armies, their own resources, their own ambitions, and they were willing to use all of that to shape the political landscape of India.
So the Second Carnatic War, it might have been a truce, but it really set the stage for what was to come.
It did. And in the Third Carnatic War, we'll see these trends that we've been talking about. They'll become even more pronounced.
The struggle for control of India was about to enter its final and most decisive phase.
And the consequences of that struggle would be felt for generations to come.
Okay, so we're back and we're ready to dive into the final chapter of this epic saga, the Third Carnatic War.
The climax, you could say.
Exactly. And remember, we left off with the Second Carnatic War ending in that, well, somewhat unsatisfying truce with the Treaty of Pondicherry.
Right, but everyone knew that things weren't really settled.
The rivalry was still burning hot.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this Third Carnatic War, well, it gets even more interesting because it becomes entangled with this much bigger conflict.
A conflict that was happening on a global scale.
Right. The 7 Years' War, often considered the first truly global war.
The stakes were even higher this time.
Absolutely. It was a massive clash of empires, a war that spanned continents, drew in almost all the major European powers.
And like you said, it had a huge impact on what was happening in India.
It was like a giant earthquake sending shockwaves all the way across the world.
So how did this European war translate into conflict in India? Was it just a case of whatever happens in Europe, we fight about it in India?
Well, it was more complicated than that.
There were local factors at play too, right?
Exactly. While the 7 Years' War certainly provided the backdrop, there were very specific reasons why it inflamed the situation in India. Both the British and the French, they saw this as a chance to finally settle the score, to deliver that knockout blow to their rival and secure dominance in the region.
This was it, the final showdown.
And the stakes, they were incredibly high. Control of India meant control of vast resources, control of trade routes, control of a huge population that could be harnessed for both economic and military purposes.
It was about more than just territory.
Much more. It was about shaping the future of an entire subcontinent.
So at 1757, the 7 Years' War is raging across the globe, and the Third Carnatic War erupts in India. What are some of the key events that our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, should know about?
Well, right off the bat, it seems like the French have the upper hand.
Really? After all those setbacks in the previous wars?
They do. In 1758, they managed to recapture Madras.
Wow, that must have been a huge symbolic victory.
Oh, it was a major blow to British morale. But, as we've seen in the past, the British were incredibly resilient. They weren't going to just roll over and accept defeat.
They always seem to find a way to bounce back.
They do, and there were a few key reasons for that. First, the British East India Company. It was a remarkably well-organized and well-funded entity.
They had their act together, so to speak.
Absolutely. They had a strong logistical network, a steady supply of resources coming in from back home, and a growing number of experienced officers and soldiers.
So they had the infrastructure to support their ambitions.
Exactly. And second, the British were often more adaptable and pragmatic in their approach to warfare in India. They were willing to forge alliances with local rulers, adopt local fighting styles, and they really understood how to use the terrain and climate to their advantage.
So it wasn't just about brute force, it was about being smart and adaptable.
Exactly. And those factors really come into play as the war progresses. The British, under the leadership of Sir Eyre Coote, they launch a series of successful counterattacks.
Coote was a formidable opponent.
He was. And in 1759, they managed to recapture Madras, taking back what the French had gained just a year earlier.
A tit for tat, you could say.
And Coote doesn't stop there.
He keeps the pressure on.
He does. And in 1760, he achieves an even more decisive victory, one that's often considered the turning point of the entire conflict. The Battle of Wandiwash.
Wandiwash, that's a name that every UPSC aspirant should definitely know.
It's not just another battle, it's a pivotal moment in Indian history.
It really shifted the balance of power.
It did. In this battle, Coote's forces completely outmaneuver and defeat the French army, led by Lally.
A crushing defeat.
It was. And it basically shatters French hopes of dominating South India.
Their ambitions were finally crushed.
In many ways, yes. Wandiwash marked the beginning of their decline as a major power in the region. After this, they never really recovered.
It's amazing how one battle can have such a lasting impact.
It is. And for those studying for the UPSC, it's not enough to just know the outcome of Wandiwash. You need to be able to analyze its significance.
What were the long-term consequences?
Well, it demonstrated that the British were becoming increasingly superior in terms of military skill and resources. It also solidified their control over key territories, paving the way for their eventual expansion across the entire subcontinent.
It was the beginning of the end, in a sense.
In many ways, yes. The French dream of a vast Indian empire, it died at Wandiwash.
So the Third Carnatic War ends with a decisive British victory. And back in Europe, the 7 Years' War concludes in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. What does this treaty mean for the future of India?
Well, the Treaty of Paris is a major turning point in global history, and its impact on India is profound.
It seals the deal, so to speak.
It does. It formalizes the decline of French power in India. While they're allowed to retain a few minor trading posts, their territorial ambitions are effectively crushed.
They're relegated to the sidelines.
Exactly. The British, on the other hand, they emerge from this conflict as the undisputed dominant European power in India. They're now in a position to transform the subcontinent into a vast colonial empire.
So in the span of just a few decades, 3 wars completely reshaped the landscape of power in India.
It's remarkable, really, how quickly things change.
The British East India Company, which started as this humble trading enterprise, is now a force that controls the destiny of millions of people.
And it's important to remember that this transformation wasn't just about military victories or strategic alliances. It was about the imposition of a foreign culture, a foreign economic system, a foreign way of life on the people of India.
The consequences were far-reaching.
Absolutely. The Carnatic Wars mark a pivotal moment, not just in the history of British colonialism, but in the history of India itself.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, from those early European encounters all the way to the rise of British dominance.
It's been a fascinating journey through a crucial period in Indian history.
And a period that's essential to understand for anyone who wants to grasp the complexities of modern India.
So we want to thank all of you for joining us on this deep dive into the Carnatic Wars.
We hope you found it insightful, informative.
And if you did, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like.
We'd love to have you along for our future deep dives into history.
Because as we've seen today, history isn't just about dates and names.
It's about understanding the forces that shaped the world we live in.
It's about analyzing the choices made by those who came before us.
And it's about learning from the past so we can build a better future.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history.
We'll see you next time.